This is part 2 of our lesson on solving polynomial equations. So there are 3 different ways that we discuss in this course about solving equations. One of them is by rearranging to isolate the variable. That's what the previous lesson was about. Quadratic formula, which works when the equation is in a certain format, or factoring. Those are our 3 methods. So we're going to talk about quadratic formula. And unfortunately, my computer froze while I was recording this part, so it's already partially filled in, but I'll talk you through it. So when we want to solve by the quadratic formula, it needs to be a quadratic, right? So it has to have highest exponent of 2. So it should have x squared, x, and a number, although sometimes you could use it if you have x squared and a number, or even just x squared and the x, but you at least need to have something with a power of 2 as your highest exponent if you want to use the quadratic formula. So the formula for the quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac, and then all divided by 2a. So I subbed in the values for a, b, and c. A is always the coefficient of x squared, b is always the coefficient of x, and then c is always the constant. And I should point out that when you're solving by quadratic formula or factoring, it should always equal 0 on the other side. And if it doesn't equal 0, you need to rearrange and move all of the terms to one side so that you can use the quadratic formula. So I subbed in 10 for b, so I did negative 10 plus or minus, and then 10 squared minus 4 times a, which is 50, and then times c, which is negative 3, and then that whole thing is divided by 2 times a, which is 50. So I was in the process of doing some calculations when everything froze, so we're going to try this again. So I left the negative 10 plus and minus, and I'm working out the number underneath the square root, and I'm going to do that all in one step on my calculator. So I'm going to do 10 squared minus 4 times 50 times negative 3, and then I'm going to hit equals. And I get 700. So a good idea to calculate along with me so that you're sure that you know how to use your calculator. In the denominator, 2 times 50, I can actually do that in my head. That is 100, but you're welcome to use your calculator for that as well. Now, I noticed in the question it asked me to leave my answer in simplified exact form. So that means I don't want to use a decimal because the square root of 700, if you try it out, 700 is not a perfect square and I would end up with a decimal. So I don't just want to work it out. What I want to do instead is use the skills that we just reviewed in the previous part about writing it as a mixed radical. So I can't really do anything with this if I want an exact value, but what I can do is see if we can write 70 as a mixed radical. So, sorry, square root of 700. So I'm going to take that off to the side and say that the square root of 700. Well, I noticed that it ends in 2 zeros. And that to me is a clue that it divides by 100. So I think this is going to be the square root of 100 times the square root of 7. So remember, we always want one of the numbers to be a perfect square so that we can work it out. The square root of 100 is 10, and then the square root of 7 is a decimal. I don't really want the decimal because it told me in the question it needed to be an exact form. So I'm going to replace the square root of 700 with 10 root 7. So this is going to become x equals negative 10 plus or minus 10 root 7, and then all divided by 100. So when I'm looking at this, I notice in the numerator that this term has 10, this term is 10, and the bottom part is 100. So what I could do is I can divide the numerator and the denominator by 10 in order to reduce. So really what I would usually do is ignore the root because we kind of treat that like a variable, and then look at my coefficients and my number on the bottom and see if they have anything in common. And they do all divide by 10. So negative 10 divided by 10 is negative 1. Plus and minus, and then 10 divided by 10 is 1. So I could write 1 root 7 or I could just write root 7. That 1 likes to hide. And then 100 divided by 10 is 10. Now, I don't think I can simplify that any further, but I am going to split it into my two final answers. So x is either going to equal -1 plus 1 root 7, or the square root of 7, divided by 10, or x equals -1 minus the square root of 7, divided by 10. Those are my two solutions. So it didn't want a decimal, so I'm not going to use my calculator to evaluate that. I'm just going to leave it in exact form, which means we leave the root. All right, so you can join me in the next video to do the second example.